What would you do if the seat you paid for, the one printed clearly on your boarding pass, was suddenly declared not yours? What if the reason wasn't policy, but prejudice? This is exactly what happened to Jordan Carter, a calm, brilliant black CEO who boarded AeroSky Flight 392 expecting nothing more than a quiet journey to prepare for a keynote speech. Instead, he was confronted by a flight attendant, a cabin supervisor, and even the captain, all insisting he give up his rightful seat. Not because of any rule, but because a wealthy passenger always sat there. Phones recorded, whispers spread, and in a matter of minutes, what began as a single injustice in Seat 2A spiraled into a global reckoning for an entire airline. But here's the question. How did one man, humiliated in front of strangers, turn that moment of bias into the spark that redefined an entire industry? What gave him the strength to stay calm? When others tried to strip away his dignity, stay with us as we unfold the story of courage, betrayal, and justice. A story that asks, what would you have done in his place? If you believe dignity should never be negotiable, hit like, share this video, and subscribe. Let's begin. The cabin lights of AeroSky Flight 392 glowed with a polished warmth, the kind designed to make first class feel like a sanctuary above the clouds. Plush leather seats stretched into beds, champagne glasses sparkled under the soft illumination, and attendants moved with rehearsed grace. It was the kind of setting where appearances mattered, where the cut of a suit or the gleam of a watch silently dictated the unspoken hierarchy among travelers. In Seat 2A sat Jordan Carter, quietly settling in with his tablet balanced on his lap. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a simple white shirt, he looked no different from any other well-heeled traveler. To the casual eye, he was just another passenger on a cross-country flight from Newark to San Francisco. But beneath the composed exterior, Jordan carried a story and a strength that few in the cabin could imagine. He glanced once at the boarding pass tucked neatly into the side pocket of his bag. The seat was as selected and paid for well in advance. He'd chosen 2A for its legroom and privacy. Knowing he needed the hours in the air to finalize the keynote presentation he would deliver at the Global Innovation and Ethics Forum the next morning. The irony was not lost on him. His company, Lumina Tech Systems, had spent the last decade pioneering artificial intelligence designed to detect and eliminate hidden bias in customer interactions. He had built a $3 billion empire on the belief that fairness could be engineered into everyday systems. And yet, sitting here, he was about to encounter the very kind of bias his life's work sought to dismantle. As boarding slowed, Jordan noticed the subtle shift in energy nearby. A flight attendant approached, her smile tight, her steps deliberate. Heather Collins was her name. He had glimpsed it on the gleaming gold pin fastened to her uniform earlier. Her voice carried the syrupy politeness of airline service, but her eyes betrayed something colder. "Sir," she said, stopping at his row, "there appears to be a mix-up. I'll need you to move so that we can accommodate one of our VIP guests." Jordan looked up from his tablet, his expression calm but questioning. "A mix-up? This is my assigned seat." He slid his boarding pass from the pocket and held it up for her to see. Heather's smile didn't waver, but her tone hardened. "Yes, I understand. But Seat 2A is typically reserved for our preferred elite travelers. Ms. Whitfield has flown this route dozens of times and always sits here." Jordan followed Heather's subtle gesture toward the aisle. Where Catherine Whitfield stood a woman in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a cream suit, a designer bag perched on her forearm like a trophy. She tapped her gold watch impatiently, eyes narrowed at Jordan as though he were trespassing on sacred ground. "I always sit there," Catherine murmured loudly, ensuring the words carried beyond Jordan's row. It's practically my seat at this point. Around them, several passengers exchanged glances. Some frowned. Others raised their phones just high enough to catch the exchange without drawing attention. The hum of whispers rippled through the cabin, a tide of judgment and curiosity mingling in equal measure. Jordan inhaled slowly. He had dealt with moments like this before, subtle dismissals, challenges to his place in spaces where he was presumed not to belong. He knew the sting of being questioned, the quiet violence of being told without words that you didn't fit. But he also knew his worth, and no amount of polished entitlement from a stranger could shake that. I am an elite member, Jordan said evenly, showing his black AeroSky Elite card, and this is my assigned seat. For the briefest flicker of a second, surprise crossed Heather's face, but it vanished quickly, replaced with a brittle professionalism. I understand, sir, she replied, but this particular seat is usually set aside for Ms. Whitfield. She travels with us regularly. The implication was clear. His presence, despite his status, was an inconvenience to be resolved. Catherine's lips curved into a smile of smug satisfaction, as if the matter were already decided. Jordan leaned back slightly, his voice calm, but firm, with all respect. There's no policy that says my paid and assigned seat must be surrendered, because someone else prefers it. I intend to stay. Heather shifted uncomfortably, the facade of courtesy slipping as tension coiled around her words. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in another cabin. Sir. No, Jordan replied, his gaze steady. I specifically chose this seat for the legroom. I have work to do. It was a simple answer, but in the charged atmosphere of first class, it landed like a challenge. Passengers craned their necks. Whispers grew louder, and the faint glow of recording lights reflected off glasses and phone cases. A scene was brewing, and everyone knew it. Catherine sighed dramatically, clutching her handbag closer. This is outrageous, she declared. I have an important meeting when we land. I shouldn't even have to explain why I need my usual seat. Heather's composure strained. She gave Jordan one last look, then turned sharply on her heel and disappeared toward the front of the cabin. The silence she left behind was taut, brittle, like the air before a storm. Jordan exhaled and refocused on his tablet. His fingers traced the notes for his speech, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He remembered his father's words, spoken years ago at a funeral when the world had felt unbearably cruel. Dignity isn't given. Son, it's claimed. Those words had carried him through the night's coding in a cramped studio apartment, through the years of rejection letters, through the meetings where investors saw only his skin and not his vision. And they carried him now, sitting in seat 2A, refusing to be quietly erased. He knew the situation wasn't over. The look in Heather's eyes, the entitlement in Catherine's tone, it was only the beginning. Something inside him stirred. Not anger exactly, but a sense of inevitability. He had spent a lifetime preparing for battles like this, battles fought not with fists or fury, but with composure and truth. Across the aisle, a young woman in a sleek blazer adjusted her phone, angling it ever so slightly toward Jordan's row. Her face betrayed no expression, but the small red light of recording glimmered faintly. She, too, seemed to sense that what was unfolding was bigger than a seating dispute, that the moment held a weight beyond its surface. Jordan sat quietly, the hum of the engines filling the silence. His brow furrowed slightly, but his posture remained steady. He knew what was coming, and he knew one thing with unshakable certainty: he wasn't moving. The minutes ticked by, heavy with silence. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending to look at magazines or adjust their seatbelts, but their attention never strayed far from seat 2A. A storm was quietly brewing, and everyone in the cabin could feel the electricity. Jordan Carter sat upright, eyes fixed on his tablet screen, though he had stopped reading. His notes blurred as he replayed the exchange in his head. He had kept his voice calm, his words deliberate, yet the familiar sting burned under his skin. It was not the request itself that unsettled him, but the way it had been made the assumption that his presence in that seat was negotiable, that his dignity was less binding than the whims of someone deemed more valuable. Heather Collins returned a few minutes later, her footsteps brisk and posture stiff. She wasn't alone this time. Following just behind her was Mark Davidson, the cabin supervisor, a man whose reputation among the crew was whispered about in break rooms and back offices. He carried himself with the rigid posture of someone used to being obeyed. His uniform crisp, his jaw set. He radiated the kind of authority that often went unchecked at 30,000 feet. "Sir," Mark said, stopping directly in front of Jordan's row, "I need you to relocate to accommodate a VIP guest." His tone was not a suggestion. It was a directive, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Jordan looked up, meeting his eyes. His own voice was steady, unshaken. "I have already shown my boarding pass and my elite status. This is my assigned seat." A faint muscle in Mark's jaw twitched. He leaned down slightly, lowering his voice, though the surrounding silence made it easy for everyone to hear. "Maybe you're not aware of how things work here. Exceptions are made for valued passengers with special needs." Catherine Whitfield, still hovering in the aisle with her designer handbag clutched close, let out a dramatic sigh. "This is ridiculous," she announced loudly. "I have an important connection. I always sit here, and now I am being inconvenienced by this nonsense." Murmurs spread across the cabin like ripples on water. Some passengers frowned at her entitlement. Others nodded along, their eyes darting between Jordan and the crew. And then came the words Jordan had heard too many times in his life, spoken in hushed tones from behind him. "He doesn't even look like someone who could afford that seat," a man muttered. Jordan's chest tightened, but he inhaled deeply, keeping his composure. He reminded himself of the promise he had made at his father's graveside years earlier, to never let the world's cruelty define his worth. Still, the weight of those words pressed heavy. He thought briefly of his mother, who had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table after his father's death. He thought of the nights he had spent coding in a cramped studio apartment, hungry but determined. He thought of the boardrooms where he had walked in with ideas that could reshape industries, only to be mistaken for the intern. Every time, he had stayed calm, stayed steady, and let his work speak louder than prejudice. This was no different. "No," Jordan said firmly, though his tone remained respectful. "I'm not moving." The cabin seemed to exhale at once, passengers leaning forward in anticipation. Mark's face flushed red, a deep scarlet that climbed his neck. This was not the compliance he expected. "We can do this the easy way," Mark said, his voice dropping lower, sharper, "or the hard way. It's your call." The words hung heavy in the air, the kind of threat designed to break a person's resolve. A few passengers gasped softly. Others lifted their phones higher, small red recording lights blinking like fireflies in the dim cabin. Jordan's gaze never wavered. "I have no intention of giving up the seat I paid for," he replied. "This is my seat." Mark straightened abruptly, tugging at his collar, his anger simmering. Without another word, He turned sharply and strode to the front of the cabin, Heather trailing behind him with anxious glances over her shoulder. Jordan closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. He knew what would come next. It was never just about the seat. It was about testing how far he would bend before breaking. Across the aisle. Alyssa Green watched quietly, her phone angled just so. She had begun recording when Heather first approached Jordan, and now her footage captured every word, every glance, every tightening jaw. She wasn't sure what compelled her to document it, only that something about the scene felt deeply wrong. The way Catherine's entitlement filled the air, the way Mark's voice cut sharp with implied threat, the way Jordan, composed and unwavering, sat as though rooted not just to the seat, but to a principle larger than himself. Alyssa thought of her younger brother, who had once been humiliated in a store for trying to use a gift card. She thought of her own fear of speaking up when she had witnessed coworkers overlooked for promotions. She couldn't change those moments, but she could capture this one. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept recording. Jordan opened his eyes and glanced around the cabin. He could feel the eyes on him, some sympathetic, some suspicious, some indifferent. He could almost hear the silent judgments. Why not just move? Why cause trouble? But he also saw something else in the faces of a few passengers. Recognition, understanding, quiet solidarity. He thought again of the keynote he was preparing, the one where he would stand before an audience of industry leaders and argue that technology must be designed to expose the biases humans often refuse to admit. How strange, he thought, that his own life kept handing him examples, like painful case studies written in real time. He considered the consequences. He knew that resisting meant escalation. He knew security might be called, that humiliation might follow. He could see the headlines already forming in his mind, the edited clips on social media. And yet, he also knew that to move without resistance would mean something far worse. It would mean conceding that his dignity was negotiable. He would not do that. A few rows back, a passenger whispered, "He should just move. It's not worth the fight." Another voice replied softly, "But if it were you, would you?" The question lingered in the cabin, unanswered. 10 minutes passed. Then the cockpit door opened, and Captain Thomas Reynolds stepped out. His face was lined with the calm professionalism of a man used to storms in the sky. But this was no storm of weather. This was a storm of humanity, and the cabin had become its center. The captain walked down the aisle, his presence commanding silence. Behind him, Mark Davidson returned, his expression smug, as if victory were already his. Heather followed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, nerves etched in every line of her face. Captain Reynolds stopped at seat 2A, towering over Jordan. "Sir, I understand there's a situation," he said, his voice measured. "Our crew has discretion to reassign seats to maintain the comfort of all passengers." Jordan looked up, facing 3 uniforms, 3 pairs of eyes expecting compliance. The imbalance of power was palpable. Still, his voice remained calm. "With all respect." "Captain," Jordan said, "I have a confirmed seat assignment. I am an elite member. I chose this seat specifically to prepare for a professional presentation. There is no rule that says I must give up my seat because another passenger prefers it." Mark's lips curved into a smile, a shadow of triumph, as though he had orchestrated the scene perfectly. "If you continue to be uncooperative," Mark interrupted, "we'll have no choice but to remove you from the aircraft." The words struck like a slap. Gas rippled through the cabin. Phones lifted higher. The atmosphere thickened, the weight of injustice pressing against the walls. Jordan's brow lifted, a flash of disbelief crossing his otherwise composed face. "Are you seriously threatening to remove me?" he asked slowly, "for refusing to give up the seat I rightfully paid for?" The cabin went still. The question hung heavy, echoing louder than the engines themselves. The silence after Jordan's question hung thick, a silence so heavy that even the steady hum of the engines seemed to dim. Passengers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the captain and the man in seat 2A. The tension had reached a threshold, a point from which there was no easy return. Captain Reynolds's face remained calm, but his eyes betrayed discomfort. He had been in difficult situations before: storms, mechanical issues, unruly passengers. But this was different. This was not about safety or security. This was about dignity. He knew it. Jordan knew it. The entire cabin knew it. Mark Davidson, standing just beside him, leaned down so close that Jordan could smell the faint trace of cologne mixed with stress. "We can handle this quietly," Mark whispered, though his words were loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Or we can make it harder than it needs to be. Your choice." Jordan's chest tightened. He had heard versions of this before, in different places, different forms, at boardroom tables, where his proposals were dismissed until someone else repeated them, at restaurants, where servers handed the check to the white colleague beside him, in airports, where security pulled him aside randomly for checks more often than chance would allow. He inhaled slowly, centering himself. He thought of the promise he had made as a teenager, standing beside his father's grave, a promise to never allow others to define his worth by their prejudice, a promise to hold his dignity, even when others tried to strip it away. "I am not moving," Jordan said again, voice steady, measured, unshaken. The cabin collectively held its breath. The defiance was not loud, but it was absolute. Catherine Whitfield let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head dramatically. "This is outrageous," she announced to no one in particular. "I have flown this route for years. Everyone knows I always sit here. This is beyond unprofessional." Her voice carried through the cabin, and Jordan could hear the murmurs beginning again. Some passengers echoed her frustration, muttering about delays, about troublemakers, about people not knowing their place. Others sat in silence, unease written on their faces. Alyssa Green's phone remained steady in her hand, the small red recording light glowing like a beacon. Her heart hammered, but she kept filming. Every word, every gesture, every smirk was being captured. She didn't know what would happen with the footage, but she knew this moment was important. Jordan reached calmly into his jacket pocket. He moved deliberately, careful not to appear sudden. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and lifted it slightly. The red circle of his recording app blinked to life. "I want to document what's happening," he said, his voice still even. "I am being threatened with removal from this flight, not for breaking any rules, but for declining to give up the seat I booked, paid for, and was assigned, simply because another passenger wants it." Gas fluttered through the cabin. Mark's face flushed crimson. His hand shot forward, reaching toward the phone. "You can't record in here," he barked, his voice cracking with anger. Jordan shifted his hand just out of reach, his composure unbroken. "There is no federal law against recording unless it interferes with crew operations. I am not interfering. I am protecting myself." Mark froze mid-motion, caught off guard by the clarity, the precision of Jordan's words. He dropped his hand, but his eyes burned with fury. Heather Collins stood a step back, her posture stiff, her eyes flickering nervously toward the passengers who were now openly recording. Her years of carefully curating relationships with frequent flyers, of keeping Catherine Whitfield comfortable, were unraveling before her eyes. "Sir," Captain Reynolds began, his voice more formal now, "if you continue to be uncooperative, we will have to remove you from the aircraft." Jordan tilted his head slightly, eyes never leaving the captain's. "Am I being removed for refusing to surrender my assigned seat to another passenger?" The question cut clean, slicing through the professional veneer. The captain hesitated, his mouth opening, then closing again. The pause was long enough to reveal the truth. There was no real justification, only the weight of prejudice and convenience. From a few rows back, a man muttered under his breath, "He should just get off. He doesn't belong here anyway." But another voice followed quickly, sharper. He paid for his seat. Why should he move? The divide in the cabin deepened. The whispers louder now, no longer subtle. Lines were being drawn in real time. Jordan's phone kept recording, the red circle unwavering. Inside, though, his thoughts churned. He imagined the humiliation of being escorted off this flight, the headlines that would follow, the smirk on Catherine's face as she slid into the seat he had rightfully claimed. A part of him ached to avoid the spectacle, to walk away quietly. But another part, the stronger part, knew this was bigger than him. He thought of his employees back at Lumina Tech, many of whom had faced similar indignities. He thought of young kids, watching how the world treated people who looked like them. He thought of his own father, whose life had been cut short by violence that stemmed from hate. To move would be to betray all of them. He sat taller, his expression calm. "I will not move." Mark clenched his fists at his sides, his composure cracking. He glanced at Heather, then at Catherine. Catherine raised an eyebrow, tilting her head toward Jordan as if to say, "Fix this." Heather hesitated only a moment before stepping closer to Catherine. Her hand moved with subtle precision, slipping something small and folded into Mark's palm. A quick exchange, practiced, discreet, but not discreet enough. A passenger in row 3 caught the moment on camera. Alyssa, still filming from across the aisle, noticed too. Her eyes widened. She zoomed in, her phone capturing every detail, the slip of cash, the muttered words, Catherine's smug smile. "Thanks for handling this little issue," Catherine whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Mark's expression tightened, the flush of his cheeks deepening as he pocketed the bills. Jordan saw it, and though his expression barely shifted, inside his chest the weight grew heavier. This wasn't just bias. This was corruption, blatant and unapologetic. The cabin buzzed now, the whispers no longer whispers at all. Did she just pay him? Someone asked. Did you see that another passenger said? Phones angled higher. Screens glowed. The story was spreading beyond the confines of row 2. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable. "Security will be contacted," he announced, his voice carrying through the cabin. "This passenger will be removed." Heather exhaled in relief. Catherine smiled in triumph, and Mark's shoulders squared with the confidence of someone who believed the battle was already won. But Jordan Carter, still seated in 2A, kept his gaze steady, his phone recording, his voice calm. "I will comply when shown the policy I violated," he said. "Until then, I will remain in my assigned seat." The words resonated through the cabin, more powerful than any outburst could have been. Not anger, not shouting, just quiet, unwavering conviction. And in that moment, everyone watching knew this was no longer about a seat. This was about something far greater. The tension inside the cabin had grown unbearable, like air before a storm. Every eye was on Jordan Carter in seat 2A. Every camera angled discreetly or not so discreetly in his direction. The quiet strength in his voice contrasted sharply with the harshness of the crew standing over him. Heather Collins folded her arms across her chest, lips pressed tight as though she were clinging to authority by force alone. Mark Davidson paced slightly, shoulders rigid, his face set in that smug determination of someone who thought he had already won. And Catherine Whitfield, the self-proclaimed queen of 2A, leaned casually against the seat in front of her, her designer watch catching the cabin light. Her smirk was the kind reserved for people who never imagined losing. Captain Thomas Reynolds had retreated toward the galley, his presence shrinking under the weight of what was happening. He had made his pronouncement, left his warning, and now seemed unwilling to meet Jordan's gaze again. Jordan sat still, the phone recording discreetly from his lap. His heart beat steadily, but not quickly. It was the strange calm of someone standing in the eye of a storm. He knew what was coming next. He could almost feel the footsteps echoing down the jet bridge before they even arrived. Then they did. The cabin doors hissed open. 2 uniformed airport security officers stepped inside, their presence commanding attention. The murmur of whispers died instantly. A ripple of unease passed through the rows. The officers moved down the aisle with heavy steps, guided by Mark's subtle gesture toward row 2. "Sir," the taller officer began as he reached Jordan, his tone firm but not aggressive. "We've been asked to escort you off the aircraft." Jordan lifted his eyes to meet the man's, calm, steady. "I would like to understand," he said, his voice clear enough for the cabin to hear, "exactly what airline policy I have violated. I am in my assigned seat. I have a valid boarding pass. I am an elite member of this airline. What rule have I broken?" The officer hesitated. He glanced at his partner, who avoided his eyes. Then he looked over at Mark Davidson. Mark nodded sharply, as though to remind him of the script. "You're being removed for causing a disturbance," the officer replied at last. But even as he spoke the words, they rang hollow. His posture betrayed doubt. Jordan let the silence stretch before responding. He turned his gaze to the captain, who had inched forward again, his jaw tight. "Captain Reynolds," Jordan said evenly, "am I being removed for refusing to surrender my seat to another passenger?" The captain shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing the edge of his uniform as though he could straighten the truth back into place. "You are being removed," he said at last, "for disrupting boarding." A wave of quiet disbelief washed over the cabin. A few passengers gasped audibly. Others shook their heads. The dissonance was clear. The man in seat 2A had remained calm throughout, his words measured, his movements deliberate. The only disruption had come from those determined to push him out. Catherine seized the moment. She straightened her posture and spoke loudly enough to be heard by the back rows. "Finally," she declared, "this has gone on long enough. Some people just don't understand how things work up here." Her words landed like poison, sharp and dismissive. A couple of passengers murmured their agreement, but many more recoiled. Phones were raised higher now. The angle of Alyssa Green's camera caught Catherine's smug expression in stark detail. Jordan exhaled once, then gathered his tablet and notes with deliberate care. He stood slowly, his back straight, his head held high. His dignity was his armor. Though his chest burned with humiliation, though his stomach churned with disbelief, he refused to let them see defeat. As he stepped into the aisle, He caught the eyes of several passengers. Some looked away, ashamed. Others nodded in silent solidarity. Alyssa met his gaze, her expression filled with urgency. She mouthed 2 words, "I'm filming." He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. The officers flanked him, guiding him down the narrow aisle. Passengers leaned aside as he passed, their whispers like a chorus around him. Unbelievable. He didn't do anything. Finally, now we can leave. This is wrong. The words blurred together, a patchwork of judgment and sympathy, dismissal and defense. As Jordan neared the front of the cabin, Catherine leaned slightly toward Mark. The move was quick, practiced. She slipped a folded bill into the supervisor's jacket pocket. "Thank you for handling this," she whispered. "First class should really maintain its standards." The sound was faint, but it carried just enough to be caught by Alyssa's recording. The lens zoomed, catching the flash of cash, the satisfied curl of Catherine's lips. Jordan saw it too. His eyes flicked toward the exchange, then back forward. He didn't stop walking. He didn't break stride. But inside, his conviction deepened. This was no misunderstanding. It was corruption dressed as protocol. When he stepped through the cabin doors and out into the jet bridge, the air felt colder, sterile. The officers slowed, clearly uncertain of their role now that he had left without resistance. One of them cleared his throat. "Sir," he said quietly, "we're sorry for the inconvenience." Jordan stopped. He turned his head slightly, his profile calm against the fluorescent light. This was not an inconvenience. He replied, "This was discrimination." The officer shifted uncomfortably, eyes dropping. His partner muttered something about paperwork and moved ahead. Jordan walked into the terminal, phone still recording. The humiliation sat heavy on his shoulders, but beneath it was something stronger, a resolve forged long before this day. He had endured worse, survived worse, risen through worse. This was simply the latest chapter in a story he had promised to rewrite. He found a quiet corner near the terminal windows and lowered himself into a chair. For a moment, he closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He felt the sting of tears threatening, but he pushed them back. Not here, not now. He pulled out his phone again, opened the voice recorder, and began speaking in steady tones. Every detail, every word, every flicker of expression, not just for himself, but for the truth. As he spoke, a voice interrupted. "Excuse me." Jordan opened his eyes. Alyssa Green stood before him, her phone in hand. She looked nervous, but determined. "I followed you off," she said softly. "I couldn't just sit there. I filmed everything. From the first time Heather spoke to you, all the way until now, including the cash." She held out her phone, the screen showing a frozen frame of Catherine's hand, slipping the bill into Mark's jacket. "This was wrong," Alyssa continued, her voice trembling. "It was discrimination. And I think people need to see it. For the first time since stepping off the plane." Jordan's expression softened. Gratitude flickered across his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This could make a difference." They exchanged contact information. Alyssa promised to send the full, unedited footage. She even offered to testify, should it ever come to that. As she walked away, Jordan sat back and allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He thought of his father, of the promise he had made, of the world he wanted for his employees, for his community, for the young people watching. This wasn't just about Seat 2A anymore. This was about accountability, about change, and he knew. As he sat staring at the runway lights, that the airline had chosen the wrong person to humiliate. Back inside the aircraft, Catherine slid comfortably into seat 2A, champagne flute in hand. Heather bent down with an exaggerated smile. "So sorry for the inconvenience, Ms. Whitfield. We'll make sure the rest of your flight is flawless." Catherine smirked, savoring her triumph. She had no idea her victory had already been recorded, preserved, and prepared to go viral. And outside, Jordan Carter was just beginning to fight back. Jordan sat in the quiet lounge tucked at the far end of the terminal, his phone buzzing relentlessly on the table in front of him. He hadn't touched the complimentary snacks. His tablet was still zipped inside his leather bag. The only thing he cared about was the message that had just come through Alyssa's unedited video file. He clicked play. The footage began with Heather's clipped voice. Her artificial smile stretched thin as she leaned over him in seat 2A. It captured the disdain in her tone, the way Catherine loomed behind her like royalty awaiting her throne. It caught every word, every angle of entitlement. Then came Mark, his threats delivered with smug authority. And finally, the money clear as day. Catherine slipping folded bills into his jacket, whispering about maintaining standards. Jordan paused the video, staring at the frozen frame. Catherine's face gleamed with satisfaction. Mark's pocket opened like an invitation. It was the evidence he needed, more damning than anything he could have described. Sophia Martinez arrived moments later, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She dropped her bag on the chair opposite him and leaned in. "I came as fast as I could," she said, slightly breathless. "Tell me everything." Jordan handed her his phone. She watched the video, her expression tightening with every passing second. When it ended, she set the device down carefully, as if it might burn her hand. "They don't know who they just threw off that plane," she said softly, fury sharpening each syllable. "This isn't just discrimination. Jordan, it's corruption. Plain and simple." Jordan nodded, his jaw set. "And it's about to cost them more than they can imagine." Sophia opened her laptop. Within minutes she had pulled in their general counsel, Marcus Lee, and head of communications, Dana Whitmore, on a video call. The lounge's sterile lighting reflected off the screen as the team assembled virtually. "The footage already has over 1 million views," Dana reported, scrolling through her analytics dashboard. "It's spreading like wildfire. 3 hashtags trending, all negative for AeroSky. Influencers are amplifying. Civil rights groups are weighing in. And mainstream media is picking it up. This isn't just a bad look. It's a full-blown crisis." Jordan clasped his hands together. "Steady. Then we treat it like one." Sophia cut in. "Marcus, start drafting legal correspondence. We'll need to preserve evidence and signal our intent to pursue every avenue if necessary. Dana, I want you to build a narrative. Not spin, not exaggeration, truth. The world will see what happened. Unedited. We don't need to embellish." "And you?" Dana asked. Jordan's eyes hardened. "I'm going to call Hawkins." Edward Hawkins, CEO of AeroSky Airlines, was at that very moment standing in his corner office overlooking downtown Chicago. His day had begun with routine quarterly projections and a call with investors. Now it was unraveling into chaos. "Sir," his PR director Monica said, her voice tight, "you need to see this." She handed him a tablet, the screen filled with Alyssa's viral video. Hawkins watched silently, his face draining of color as the story unfolded. When the money changed hands, his jaw clenched. When the video ended, he set the device down slowly. "Who is he?" he asked. Monica hesitated. "Jordan Carter, CEO of Lumina Tech Systems." The name landed like a hammer. Hawkins knew it immediately. Luminatech wasn't just another tech firm. It was the company AeroSky had been courting for months, trying desperately to secure a modernization deal worth nearly $60 million. Their AI-driven customer service software could drag AeroSky out of its current tailspin and into the future. Without it, the airline would remain outdated, inefficient, and vulnerable. "How much stock does he hold?" Hawkins asked, his voice low. Monica swallowed. According to recent filings, Luminatech has quietly accumulated nearly 24% of AeroSky's shares. When combined with their partners, that's enough to hold controlling influence. The CEO's face turned gray. This wasn't just a passenger who had been mistreated. This was the man who effectively held the airline's future in his hands. The phone on his desk rang. His assistant picked it up, whispered a few words, then handed it to him. "It's Carter," she said. Hawkins took the call, forcing a veneer of composure. "Mr. Carter," he began, "I want to personally extend my apologies for the unacceptable treatment you experienced this morning." "Save the apologies," Jordan's voice cut in, calm but unyielding. "I'm not calling to hear excuses. I'm calling because as your largest individual shareholder, I am demanding an emergency board meeting. Today." Hawkins faltered. "Surely we can." "This isn't negotiable," Jordan interrupted. "Your staff not only humiliated me, they accepted cash bribes from a passenger to remove me. That video is now global. This is not just about me, it's about your entire culture. And I will not stand by while my investment is tied to a company that tolerates discrimination and corruption." The line went quiet. Hawkins felt the weight of the boardroom pressing down on him already, though he hadn't yet stepped inside it. Back in the lounge, Jordan ended the call and looked at Sophia. "It begins now," he said simply. By late afternoon, AeroSky headquarters was in disarray. Screens glowed red with plummeting stock numbers. Analysts on financial news networks speculated on the airline's survival. Employees clustered in hallways, whispering, checking their phones, wondering what had happened. In the executive suite, Hawkins gathered his senior staff, the CFO, the COO, the general counsel. The head of operations, faces pale, lips pressed tight. The video played on the big screen once more. The room filled with uncomfortable silence. "We are already down 15% in market value," the CFO said grimly. "If Carter unloads his shares, we could see a 30% collapse by end of day." "Then stop him," Hawkins snapped. The counsel shook his head. "We can't. He's within his rights. And after what happened, he has every reason." Meanwhile, in the lounge, Jordan and his team were preparing for war. Sophia coordinated logistics for the emergency meeting. Marcus fine-tuned the legal demands. Dana curated witness statements flooding in from passengers who had filmed the incident from different angles. "It's not just Alyssa's footage," Dana said, scrolling through her inbox. "We've got 5 separate recordings, all corroborating the same sequence of events. Different angles of Catherine handing Mark the money. Different passengers noting the same discriminatory language. This isn't just one story, it's a pattern. Documented." Jordan leaned back in his chair, his gaze focused. Inside, he felt the familiar tug of conflict, the desire for justice, battling with the fatigue of yet another fight. Why should he always have to be the one proving, documenting, carrying the burden of proof? Why was dignity so costly? But he steadied himself. He thought of the young man he once was, coding late into the night in that cramped apartment, vowing to build something that mattered. He thought of his father's funeral, the vow he had made at the graveside. This fight was never just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Sophia touched his arm lightly. "You good?" Jordan nodded. "I'm ready." He looked around at his team, the people who had fought beside him through product launches, hostile takeovers, and market crashes. Now they were about to take on an airline. "This isn't just about punishing them," Jordan said, his voice steady. "It's about forcing them to change. We're going to set a standard they can't escape." Sophia smiled faintly. "And if they don't listen," Jordan's eyes sharpened, "then they'll collapse, and we'll build something better from the ashes." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the storm outside AeroSky's headquarters was only beginning. The boardroom on the top floor of AeroSky's headquarters was not designed for chaos. It was built for confidence, for quiet conversations about strategy and growth, for polite disagreements smoothed over by coffee and contracts. But today, it vibrated with tension. Directors filed in one by one, their faces drawn, their conversations clipped. Some wore golf attire, having rushed straight from country clubs. Others still had jackets slung over their shoulders, pulled from family dinners or weekend errands. No matter where they had come from, each carried the same weight the airline was in. Free fall. Edward Hawkins stood at the head of the polished oak table, staring out the glass wall at the skyline. His reflection looked older than he remembered, the gray at his temples sharper, his suit somehow looser on his frame. He had commanded this company for nearly a decade. Now, control was slipping like sand through his fingers. When the doors swung open again, the room hushed. Jordan Carter stepped inside. He wore the same navy suit from earlier, crisp and unflinching. The very suit he had been wearing when security escorted him off Flight 392. To the board, it wasn't just clothing, it was a reminder, a silent exhibit of the humiliation their staff had inflicted. His calm presence radiated authority that no one could ignore. Behind him came Sophia Martinez, tablet in hand, her expression a mix of determination and measured fury. Dana Whitmore joined as well, carrying a slim case filled with documents, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jordan took his seat at the long table, directly across from Hawkins. He set a folder on the polished wood, opened it, and then folded his hands. "Shall we begin?" Hawkins cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter." The board wishes to extend its apologies for Jordan's voice cut cleanly across the table. "I am not here for apologies." The sentence landed like a hammer. Silence spread, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Several directors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Jordan leaned forward slightly. "I am here as your largest individual shareholder, and as of today, my confidence in this airline's ability to uphold even the most basic standards of fairness has been obliterated. What happened on Flight 392 was not an inconvenience. It was systemic rot, revealed in real time." He gestured toward Dana. She rose, walked to the head of the table, and placed a tablet into the dock connected to the massive screen on the wall. The video began to play. The board watched as Heather leaned in with her faux polished smile, Catherine looming like a queen awaiting tribute. They saw Mark's posture stiffen with self-importance, his voice dripping with condescension. They saw the money pass from Catherine's hand into his jacket. They heard her whisper about maintaining standards. No narration was needed. Every damning detail glowed in high definition. When the footage ended, the silence was suffocating. Some directors couldn't meet Jordan's eyes. Others stared fixedly at the table, as though the grain of the oak might offer escape. Jordan broke the silence. "This is not an isolated mistake. It is a symptom. It tells me that your people believe discrimination can be bought, that intimidation is standard procedure, and that dignity is negotiable. I will not allow my investment to be tied to such a culture. One director, a balding man with a deep frown, finally spoke. "Mr. Carter, surely suspensions," Jordan interrupted, his voice steady but sharp enough to slice through the air. "Suspensions suggest ambiguity. There is none. The staff involved must be terminated immediately. Heather Collins, Mark Davidson, Captain Thomas Reynolds. Their conduct was indefensible." A murmur rippled through the room. Some directors nodded almost imperceptibly. Others bristled. "And there is more," Jordan continued, his eyes sweeping the table. "The $60 million modernization deal between Luminatech and AeroSky. It's canceled, effective immediately." The words struck like turbulence, shaking the room. Hawkins's face drained of color. "You can't be serious," the CFO blurted. "Without that deal, our booking systems, our AI upgrades, our customer service reforms will be years behind. Investors are already watching your stock plummet," Jordan replied calmly. "It fell 15% today alone. By end of week. If this continues, you'll be staring at collapse. Do not mistake this for a threat. It is reality." The COO leaned forward, desperation in her voice. "Mr. Carter, we understand your outrage, but surely there's another way. These employees, they've been with us for years. Union contracts, legal complexities." Jordan's gaze sharpened. "Legal complexities do not erase moral failure. If you wish to talk about contracts, then let's talk about the one you violated the contract with your passengers. To treat them with dignity and fairness. That is the only contract that matters." The room fell silent again. Sophia broke it, her voice clear. "We don't need symbolic gestures. We need systemic reform, independent audits, transparent reporting, bias training that actually changes behavior, not a 2-hour online checkbox." Jordan nodded. "This is not optional. It is survival. And if this board cannot make those commitments today, then I will act as any responsible shareholder would. I will withdraw and take the airline's future down with me." For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of his words pressed against the glass walls, heavy and undeniable. Outside, the city skyline glowed against the dusk, oblivious to the storm inside. Then the door burst open. A young analyst hurried in, out of breath, a tablet clutched in his hand. "Sir," he stammered, addressing Hawkins, "the stock, we're down 20%. Analysts project 35 by market close if the crisis isn't resolved." The boardroom erupted in whispers. Phones buzzed, faces paled. Jordan remained still, his calm a sharp contrast to their panic. "This is your decision," he said. "Accountability or collapse." Hawkins looked around the room. He saw fear in some eyes, resignation in others. He knew the truth. Jordan was right. There was no choice. He swallowed, his voice barely steady. "Effective immediately," he said. "Heather Collins, Mark Davidson, and Captain Reynolds are terminated. A full-scale reform initiative will begin at once." The board nodded, some reluctantly, others with visible relief. Jordan stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Good. Because if you had chosen otherwise, this company would not see another sunrise intact." He gathered his folder, turned, and walked toward the door. Sophia and Dana followed, their heels echoing on the polished floor. Behind them, the boardroom remained heavy with the realization that the fate of an airline had been decided not by its CEO, but by the man it had humiliated in seat 2A. In the hallway, Sophia exhaled slowly. That was brutal. Jordan's eyes softened, though his tone remained steady. It wasn't brutal. It was necessary. They thought this was about a seat. It never was. It's about what that seat represents. As they stepped into the elevator, Jordan felt the familiar churn of emotion beneath his calm. Part of him wished it didn't always come to this, that his presence, his humanity, wasn't always questioned, tested, threatened. But another part of him knew every time he stood his ground. He wasn't just standing for himself. He was standing for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. The elevator doors slid shut. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. 3 floors below the boardroom, in a narrow, windowless conference room, Heather Collins sat with her arms crossed so tightly they left faint lines in her sleeves. Mark Davidson shifted in his chair, his jaw clenched, eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. Captain Thomas Reynolds leaned back with the weary composure of a man who had been flying for decades, but his pallor betrayed him. The silence was suffocating. Each tick of the wall clock grew louder, as though mocking their attempts at calm. The door opened. In stepped Karen Lee, AeroSky's HR director, flanked by 2 legal counsel and a pair of uniformed security officers who stationed themselves by the door. The presence of security was not lost on anyone in the room. Karen set 3 folders on the table. Her expression was firm, her tone stripped of any pretense of kindness. This will be brief, effective immediately. Your employment with AeroSky Airlines is terminated. Heather's mouth fell open. Terminated. For what we followed procedure. That man was Karen, opened one of the folders, pressed play on a tablet, and swiveled the screen toward them. The footage filled the small room. Heather's face, sharp and dismissive. Mark's smug voice, his threats delivered with condescension. Catherine Whitfield slipping folded cash into his jacket. Reynolds, standing silently, refusing to intervene. Every damning moment replayed in merciless clarity. "This is what you call procedure?" Karen asked, her voice razor-sharp. Heather's protest collapsed into silence. Mark leaned forward, his voice rising. "You don't understand the pressures we face. VIP passengers like Ms. Whitfield expect what they expect." Karen cut him off. "Does not override federal law, company policy, or basic human decency. You didn't just fail a passenger. You failed this airline, and you failed yourselves." Thomas Reynolds exhaled slowly, his weathered hands folded on the table. His voice was soft, almost weary. "I thought my crew had the situation under control. I misjudged. And now. Karen interrupted. "The world has seen you misjudge. A 30-year career overshadowed by a single moment of silence." The weight of her words settled on him. He closed his eyes, as if shutting out the world would bring back the cockpit where he had once felt steady, capable, respected. Security officers stepped forward. Karen snapped the folder shut. "You will collect your belongings under supervision. Your final paycheck includes 2 weeks' severance. More than generous under the circumstances. This meeting is concluded." Heather's cheeks burned crimson. Mark muttered under his breath. A string of curses meant only for himself. Reynolds stood with slow dignity, but his shoulders sagged. As they were escorted down the hallway, employees peered out of glass offices and break rooms. Whispered conversations rippled in their wake. It was the same walk Jordan Carter had been forced to make hours earlier, escorted off a plane he had every right to be on. Only this time, the symmetry was deliberate. Back upstairs. The board meeting was adjourned. Word traveled fast. Screens across the building buzzed with updates. Staff terminated. Board accepts Carter's demands. Emergency overhaul begins. But the true reckoning came in the main auditorium. Hundreds of AeroSky employees had been gathered with little explanation. Flight attendants in Navy uniforms, gate agents still in vests from the morning rush, mechanics with grease on their hands, executives in press suits. The air hummed with nervous anticipation. Edward Hawkins took the stage, flanked by Jordan Carter and his team. For a moment, Hawkins just looked out at the crowd. He had addressed them many times before announcing expansions, celebrating milestones, but never like this. Today, Hawkins began, his voice carrying across the hall. AeroSky failed one of its passengers in the most fundamental way. The room went still. You could hear the faint shuffle of someone adjusting in their chair, the soft click of a phone camera recording. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Hawkins continued. It was discrimination. It was arrogance. It was corruption. And it stops here. He turned to Jordan. Mr. Carter, would you address our employees? Jordan stepped forward. The weight of hundreds of eyes landed on him. Some looked curious, others skeptical, some openly defensive. He felt their tension, their disbelief, their fear. He placed his hands on the podium. What happened to me today, he said, his voice steady, wasn't unique. That's the tragedy of it. It happens to people who don't have my resources, my platform, my ability to fight back every single day. The words hung heavy. A few heads bowed. I was asked to give up a seat I paid for, a seat I was assigned, not because of any policy, but because someone else decided I didn't belong there. And when I refused, I was threatened. I was humiliated, not because of my actions, but because of my appearance. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed shame, others hardened, but no one could deny the truth of what he was saying. This is not about me, Jordan continued. This is about every passenger who deserves dignity, every employee who deserves to work in a culture that doesn't reward silence, bribes, or bias. You can be part of that culture, or you can be part of the change, but you cannot be both. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of his words filled the space. Then Hawkins returned to the microphone. His tone was resolute. Starting tomorrow, every AeroSky employee from the C-suite to the ground crew will undergo comprehensive, mandatory bias training. Not a checkbox course. A reckoning, developed in partnership with Luminatech. Gas spread across the auditorium. Bias training was common, but not like this. And to make it clear, Hawkins added, all AeroSky flights will be grounded for 48 hours to make it happen. The room erupted in shock. Gasps, whispers, disbelief. Grounding an airline, even for a single hour, cost millions. 48 hours was unheard of. This is not optional, Hawkins said. It is immediate, and it is necessary. The announcement hit like a tidal wave. Some employees looked stricken, already calculating the disruptions, the chaos, the financial fallout. Others looked almost relieved, as if waiting for someone to finally take action. Jordan stood silently beside Hawkins, scanning the faces. He saw fear, resistance, hope, and something else, recognition. The recognition that the company they worked for could no longer hide behind slogans. It was being held to a higher standard. Starting now, as the employees filed out, the building buzzed with speculation. Social media had already caught fire with the news of the terminations. Within minutes, hashtags spread across platforms. Join AeroSky bias. Justice in the air. Jordan Carter. In the days that followed, the fallout was relentless. News outlets dissected every detail of the footage. Talk shows debated the symbolism of Seat 2A. Advocacy groups rallied, demanding accountability not just from AeroSky, but across the entire airline industry. And the names of Heather Collins, Mark Davidson, and Thomas Reynolds became infamous, tied forever to a viral scandal. Heather tried to defend herself in interviews, but her words rang hollow. Mark received rejection after rejection as he applied for jobs in aviation. Reynolds, once respected, was suddenly unwelcome in an industry he had given his life to. Meanwhile, Catherine Whitfield disappeared from the public eye. Her social circle shrank overnight. Her employer placed her on indefinite leave. She scrolled through headlines calling her a Karen in couture, her face plastered across screens. For the first time in her life, privilege had turned into poison, and at the center of it all was Jordan Carter. He had not asked for this fight, but he had refused to back down. Now, with millions watching, he had become the unwilling symbol of what dignity in the air could mean. The fall had begun, but the real transformation was only just starting. The next morning, airports across the country buzzed with confusion. Travelers arriving at AeroSky check-in counters were greeted not with boarding passes, but with notices all flights temporarily suspended. Please see an agent for assistance. At Newark Liberty, where Flight 392 had first taken off, screens glowed with the same message. At San Francisco International, ticket agents repeated apologies until their voices grew hoarse. At Chicago O'Hare, passengers groaned, some shouting, some throwing up their hands. Business travelers worried about missed meetings. Families fretted over missed connections, and honeymooners fought back tears as their dream trips stalled. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of planes grounded, tens of thousands of passengers stranded. Reporters swarmed terminals, cameras catching every complaint and every sign of solidarity. Unprecedented, anchors repeated on morning shows. An airline halting operations for 48 hours by choice, it's never been done. Inside AeroSky's headquarters, the weight of the decision pressed on every wall. Edward Hawkins sat in his office, staring at a spreadsheet flashing in red. The projected losses for 2 days of grounding stretched into the hundreds of millions. He pinched the bridge of his nose, the fatigue of sleepless nights finally catching up. Still, when his phone buzzed with another angry shareholder message, he muted it. He knew the short-term cost would pale in comparison to the long-term cost of doing nothing. Down the hall, conference rooms had been converted into makeshift training centers. Rows of chairs faced large screens, and employees filed in with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The program, designed by Lumina Tech, wasn't like any training they'd experienced. It didn't start with a video or a handbook. It started with a mirror. Each participant was handed a small rectangular mirror and told to look into it, while an instructor asked, "What assumptions do you make about the person you see? How often do you mistake their value for something else?" The room was silent. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. A few, reluctantly, met their own gaze. Jordan Carter watched from the back of the room. He had insisted on attending the sessions himself, not as a guest, but as a participant. When his turn came, he held the mirror steadily. "I see someone who has been underestimated," he said quietly, "and I see someone who has done the same to others. That's the part I have to own." The acknowledgment startled some employees. They had expected anger, even arrogance. Instead, they saw a man holding himself to the same standard he demanded of them. In another room, Sophia Martinez led a session. She recounted her own childhood in Texas, where her mother worked as a cleaner at an airport. "I remember her coming home exhausted," Sophia said. But what hurt most was the way people treated her like she was invisible. That's why I care so much about this work. Because no one is invisible. Dana Whitmore, Luminatech's communications head, circulated through rooms, recording footage and collecting feedback. She watched as mechanics, gate agents, and executives grappled with scenarios. A flight attendant grew defensive, arms crossed, until she was asked to role-play a passenger denied boarding because of her accent. Within minutes, her arms had dropped, her voice unsteady. That felt awful, she admitted. Like I didn't matter. The transformation wasn't instant. Some resisted, rolling their eyes, muttering about corporate theater. But the program pressed deeper, forcing employees to confront uncomfortable truths through simulations, role plays, and testimonies. Meanwhile, the outside world roared. Social media was ablaze. Hashtags surged. Videos of the incident surpassed 50 million views. Celebrities posted messages of support for Jordan. Advocacy groups staged rallies at airports, holding signs that read, "Dignity has no upgrade fee, and we all belong in 2A." News programs dissected the symbolism of the seat. Commentators debating whether AeroSky's actions were genuine reform or damage control. Some praised the bold grounding. Others scoffed at it as a desperate stunt. But no one could ignore it. Inside his hotel room in San Francisco, Jordan Carter sat by the window, watching planes take off from rival airlines. He should have been preparing for his keynote at the Global Ethics and Tech Forum, but his mind churned with something heavier. He opened his journal, a leather-bound book he carried everywhere. His pen hovered. Then he wrote, "What does it mean to change a system? Is it punishment reform, or is it planting seeds in people who don't want them, but may grow anyway?" He paused, staring at the words. For years, he had built algorithms to detect bias, trained companies to recognize patterns. But this was different. This was raw, messy, human. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Sophia entered, holding 2 coffees. She placed one on the table, sat opposite him. "You look like you're carrying the whole airline on your back," she said softly. "Maybe I am," Jordan replied with a tired smile. She leaned forward. "You don't have to. This isn't just your burden. We're in this with you." Her words steadied him. For the first time in days, he let out a long breath. Back at headquarters, Edward Hawkins held a press conference. Cameras flashed as he faced a room packed with reporters. His voice was steady but lined with fatigue. "We grounded AeroSky not because it was easy, but because it was necessary," he said. "We will not ask our passengers to trust us until we prove we are worthy of that trust. And we will not ask our employees to represent us until they learn how to represent every human being with dignity." A reporter shouted, "How can passengers trust that this isn't just PR?" Hawkins didn't flinch. "Because the man who was removed from that flight now owns 25% of this airline. And he is sitting at the table demanding accountability. This is not a press release. This is survival." The clip went viral within hours. Headlines read, "A CEO admits failure. A passenger demands change. An industry watches." As the 48 hours ticked by, small breakthroughs began to emerge inside the training rooms. A veteran mechanic admitted he had dismissed complaints from younger colleagues because he thought they were soft. A gate agent confessed she had assumed passengers of certain backgrounds were more likely to argue. A young pilot broke down in tears, recalling the time he had watched a black family denied boarding and said nothing. Each story added weight to the room. Each confession cracked the armor of denial. By the end of the second day, something remarkable happened. When employees walked out of the sessions, They didn't scatter to their cars or phones. They stood together in the lobby, talking, sharing, processing. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was the first sign of one. That evening, Jordan returned to his hotel room and watched the sunset over the bay. His phone buzzed with updates, stock prices in free fall, investors panicking, rival airlines circling like vultures. But there was also an email from a passenger who had once been denied a seat upgrade because of her headscarf. She wrote for the first time, "I feel like maybe someone cares. Thank you." Jordan closed his eyes, letting the words settle. The road ahead would be brutal. The lawsuits, the unions, the shareholders, none of it would be easy. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. The fight wasn't just about a seat. It was about every unseen passenger, every silenced employee, every assumption that had ever stripped someone of their dignity. And as he set down his journal, he whispered to himself, "We're just getting started." The 48-hour grounding rippled across the globe like an earthquake. By the morning of the third day, every major business outlet had the same headline splashed across its front page: AeroSky in crisis. Financial channels reported in panicked tones. Stock tickers flashed red as AeroSky's value nosedived. Within hours of markets opening, the company had lost nearly 30% of its market cap. Investors who once bragged about owning AeroSky shares were suddenly silent, their phones buzzing with calls they didn't want to answer. In downtown Manhattan, at the offices of Mercer and Lane Investments, analysts huddled over screens. "They've just erased $7 billion in shareholder value," one whispered, as though speaking louder would make it worse. Another shook his head. All because of one seat. But it wasn't just one seat. It was what the seat represented. Talk shows filled with debates. Morning anchors argued whether Jordan Carter was a hero or a disruptor who had gone too far. Grounding every flight for training, one host scoffed. "That punishes innocent passengers." Another countered, "Passengers were punished every day before this, only no one filmed it." On social media, hashtags surged again. "We'll belong." Site 2A and "Bo grounded for change" trended worldwide. Videos of Jordan's calm defiance played side by side with footage of Catherine Whitfield slipping money into Mark Davidson's jacket pocket. Memes exploded, some satirical, some deadly serious. One photo of Jordan standing with his carry-on as security escorted him down the aisle bore the caption, "They removed him from a seat. He removed their future." Inside AeroSky headquarters, the firestorm was suffocating. Executives shuffled through crisis meetings, the air thick with fear. Edward Hawkins had aged years and days. He pounded his fist on the conference table. "We need to get ahead of this before the DOJ or FAA steps in," he snapped. "If we don't show systemic reform, regulators will bury us." Karen Lee, the HR director, didn't flinch. "Then let's make reform impossible to ignore. The world already knows what happened. Pretending we can contain it is a lie. We have to own it." Meanwhile, lawsuits began to pour in. Civil rights groups filed class actions. Passenger advocacy organizations demanded refunds, reparations, and accountability. Attorneys circled like sharks, eager to represent anyone with a grievance against AeroSky. Jordan Carter watched the chaos unfold from his hotel suite in San Francisco. His phone never stopped buzzing, reporters begging for interviews, senators leaving voicemails, shareholders pleading for mercy. He ignored most of it. Instead, he sat at a small desk, scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad. Across the top of the page, in bold letters, he wrote, "The Dignity Protocol." It wasn't enough to punish a few bad actors. If he left it there, The company would patch over the wound and move on. The same infection festering underneath. No, this had to be structural, binding, irreversible. Sofia Martinez entered quietly, setting a plate of untouched food beside him. "You haven't eaten all day," she said. "I will," Jordan murmured, eyes fixed on his notes. "Not yet." She pulled up a chair, reading the words over his shoulder. Body cams for crew, real-time passenger feedback, independent auditing. This is heavy. Jordan, do you really think they'll agree to all this? They don't have a choice, he said simply. Not anymore. Sofia studied him, seeing both the steel and the exhaustion. She wanted to tell him to rest, to breathe, but she knew better. This was how he processed pain, by building something no one could tear down. That night, AeroSky's board convened an emergency session. The mood was grim. Shareholders dialed in from penthouses and yachts, their voices sharp with anger. "He's destroying us." One barked, "We can't let a single man dictate company policy." But another voice cut through, calmer but more lethal. "He owns 25% of this airline," said an older shareholder. "And if he pulls his investment, we're finished. He's not dictating. He's deciding whether we live or die." The silence that followed was colder than any storm. The next morning, Jordan walked into AeroSky headquarters flanked by Sofia and Dana Whitmore. Cameras flashed as they passed reporters. Microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Carter, are you here to take over the airline?" one shouted. Jordan didn't break stride. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was electric. Executives whispered. Board members adjusted ties. And Edward Hawkins sat stiffly at the head of the table. Jordan placed his yellow legal pad on the polished surface and looked around the room. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice calm but carrying. "It's about every passenger who has ever been treated as less than human because of how they look, where they're from, or what someone assumed about them. What happened to me was not unique. The only difference is that I had the power to fight back. Most people don't." He let the words hang, scanning the faces before him. Some looked away, some flushed with shame, and a few shifted with resentment. "That's why I'm proposing the dignity protocol," Jordan continued, sliding the pad toward Hawkins. "This isn't a PR stunt. This is the foundation of survival. Without it, you won't have an airline to save." Hawkins skimmed the page. His hands trembled slightly as he read 1. Mandatory body cams for all cabin crew, with footage reviewed by independent auditors. 2. Real-time passenger reporting through a secure app, escalated directly to leadership. 3. Immediate termination for staff caught accepting money, gifts, or favors from passengers. 4. Quarterly bias and empathy training developed by Luminatech. 5. Public transparency reports, detailing incidents, resolutions, and metrics. 6. Executive bonuses tied to measurable reductions in discrimination complaints. The room erupted in murmurs. Some protested, others whispered agreements. One board member shook his head violently. "This is insane. Body cams passengers will think we're a police state." Jordan didn't flinch. "Or they'll think you finally take their dignity seriously. Which message do you want to send?" The silence returned, heavier than before. Outside the boardroom, Catherine Whitfield's world was unraveling. The video of her slipping money to Mark Davidson had gone viral in ways she hadn't imagined. Former friends distanced themselves, charities revoked her invitations, and her employer placed her on indefinite leave. She had become a symbol not of privilege, but of disgrace. Her phone buzzed endlessly with messages, some hateful, others demanding apologies. For the first time in her life, She couldn't buy her way out. Back in San Francisco, ordinary passengers felt the ripple effect. A mother in Detroit who had once been denied boarding for carrying an infant car seat wept as she watched Jordan's testimony replay on TV. A veteran in Dallas remembered being told his service dog wasn't allowed in first class and clenched his fists in anger. And in a small town in Ohio, a group of college students huddled around a phone, streaming the news and nodding. "He's fighting for all of us." One whispered. The storm was far from over. AeroSky's stock continued to tumble, and regulators hinted at upcoming investigations. But something was shifting. Conversations were changing. What had once been dismissed as isolated incidents was now recognized as a systemic disease. That evening, Jordan returned to his hotel room and stood by the window, the city lights glowing below. His phone buzzed again. Another reporter, another request. He ignored it. Instead, he opened his journal and wrote one line. They thought this was about a seat. It's about who gets to sit with dignity. He closed the book, set it on the nightstand, and finally allowed himself a moment of stillness. The firestorm was raging, but deep down, he knew it was the only way forward. The morning after Jordan presented the Dignity Protocol, the Federal Aviation Administration announced a formal investigation into AeroSky Airlines. Within hours, the Department of Justice followed, citing potential violations of civil rights law. It was no longer just a scandal. It was a federal case. Headlines screamed from every corner of the country. FIO opens civil rights inquiry. AeroSky grounded in discrimination firestorm. Late-night hosts cracked jokes that stung like truth. One quipped, "AeroSky promised luxury above the clouds." Turns out, the turbulence was in their ethics. The audience roared, but for AeroSky's leadership, there was no laughter. Jordan Carter sat at the long oak table in Luminatech's headquarters in San Francisco, flanked by Sophia Martinez and Dana Whitmore. The conference room was silent except for the ticking of a clock. A pile of documents lay before him, letters from senators, invitations from advocacy groups, offers from journalists promising a sympathetic platform. He hadn't responded to any of them. Sophia broke the silence first. "The DOJ isn't messing around. If they find systemic bias in AeroSky's operations, the company could face billions in fines." Jordan leaned back, eyes distant. "Then maybe they'll finally understand that change isn't optional." Dana tapped a pen nervously against her notepad. "Jordan, you've become more than the CEO who got kicked out of his seat. You're a symbol now. People are projecting their pain onto you, their hopes too. That's a heavy weight to carry." He gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not new. I've been carrying it since Riverton." His mind flicked back to the cracked sidewalks of his childhood neighborhood, to the day he buried his father, vowing to build a world where dignity wasn't a privilege. Every step since then had been toward this moment. But even as he said it, he felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Was he ready to lead not just a company, but a movement? Meanwhile, inside AeroSky's headquarters, fear was seeping into every corner. Employees whispered in break rooms, checking social media for updates before glancing nervously at their supervisors. Cabin crews reported feeling judged by every passenger. Every smartphone camera pointed their way. In the executive wing, Edward Hawkins convened his senior team. The walls of the boardroom seemed to close in under the weight of bad news. Karen Lee presented a grim update. "We've received notice of 23 separate lawsuits since yesterday. Passenger rights groups are coordinating, calling this the largest civil action in airline history, and the FAA has ordered us to hand over all discrimination complaints from the last 10 years. One executive muttered under his breath, "That'll bury us." Hawkins' jaw tightened. He turned to his team. "We are not buried yet, but we are in a grave. We dug ourselves, and unless we accept the reforms Mr. Carter proposed, we'll never climb out." There was silence, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Some executives nodded reluctantly. Others stared down at their papers, unwilling to meet his eyes. On Capitol Hill, the scandal had become political ammunition. Lawmakers called for hearings, some demanding that AeroSky executives testify before Congress. "This is bigger than one airline," one senator declared. "This is about whether bias has infected the infrastructure of American air travel." Back in San Francisco, Jordan's days blurred into endless meetings. His nights were restless, haunted by flashes of the incident, the smirk on Mark Davidson's face, the hollow threat in Captain Reynolds' voice, the sting of walking down that aisle as passengers filmed in silence. He replayed it not with bitterness, but with a kind of clinical detachment. What had been said, what had been left unsaid, the way bias had slid under the surface of professionalism like oil beneath water. One evening, Sophia found him in his office long after midnight. His jacket was draped over a chair, his tie loosened, eyes fixed on the city lights beyond the glass. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "You can't carry this alone." Jordan turned, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do," she countered. "You built Lumina Tech on teamwork. You trusted people to share the load. This is no different. Let us help you." For a moment, his defenses slipped. The truth was, he was tired, not just from this battle, but from years of proving, again and again, that he belonged in rooms designed to exclude him. He closed his eyes, inhaled slowly, and nodded. "All right, we do this together." At the same time, Catherine Whitfield's fall from grace deepened. The video of her slipping money into Mark Davidson's pocket replayed on every network. Strangers confronted her in grocery stores, hurling words she had never been forced to hear. Her employer announced her suspension, and charities she once graced with her presence quietly removed her from their boards. In her penthouse apartment, she sat staring at her reflection, makeup smudged from tears. For the first time in her life, she felt powerless. She whispered to herself, "It was just a seat, just a seat." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. It was entitlement exposed, privilege laid bare for the world to judge. Mark Davidson, too, faced consequences he never imagined. Job offers vanished. Friends stopped returning calls. At night, he scrolled endlessly through comment sections filled with his name, paired with words like corrupt, coward, racist. He told himself it wasn't fair, that he'd been following procedure. But in the silence of his apartment, he knew the truth. He'd taken the money. He'd chosen complicity. Captain Reynolds, once respected for decades of service, found himself uninvited from professional circles. Pilots he had mentored now avoided his calls. His own reflection felt foreign, like a man he no longer recognized. Meanwhile, Jordan's influence expanded beyond the airline. Advocacy groups sought his input. Universities invited him to speak. Civil rights leaders requested meetings. Each invitation reminded him of the growing movement swirling around his name. At a press conference called by passenger rights advocates, Jordan finally stepped forward. He stood behind the podium, cameras flashing, microphones clustered like hungry mouths. His voice was steady, though inside he wrestled with the weight of expectation. "What happened to me on AeroSky Flight 392 is not unique," he said. "Every day, passengers faced discrimination, denied seats, questioned unfairly, treated as less, Most don't have the platform to fight back. That's why we must change the system itself." He paused, scanning the crowd. Some leaned forward. Others wiped tears. A few raised fists in silent solidarity. "The dignity protocol is not about punishing individuals," he continued. "It's about creating structures that prevent bias from taking root in the first place. This is not just AeroSky's problem. This is aviation's problem. This is America's problem." The applause was thunderous, rolling like waves. But when the lights dimmed and the cameras were packed away, Jordan sat alone backstage, head bowed, hands clasped. The applause faded quickly in his mind, replaced by the quiet question that had haunted him for years. Will it ever be enough? He thought of his father's grave, of the vow he had made as a boy. He thought of the countless names and faces who would never trend, never make headlines, but who carried scars all the same. Sophia entered quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did good," she said. He gave a weary smile. "We'll see." Outside, the storm raged on. Regulators sharpened their knives. Shareholders counted losses. Employees braced for change. And at the center stood Jordan Carter, unwilling to bend, unwilling to retreat, but carrying the heavy truth that transformation always comes at a cost. The investigations had only just begun. The marble halls of Capitol Hill had seen their share of storms, but few like the one brewing around AeroSky Airlines. In the weeks after the viral incident, lawmakers demanded accountability. Petitions poured in, signed by hundreds of thousands. Advocacy groups organized demonstrations outside airports from Los Angeles to Atlanta. The story was no longer just a headline. It was a movement. Jordan Carter arrived in Washington on a gray Monday morning. The air was heavy with drizzle, the kind that clung to your suit and hair no matter how many times you brushed it away. He walked up the steps of the Rayburn House office building with Sophia Martinez and Dana Whitmore by his side, his polished shoes clicking against the wet stone. Behind him, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, their voices rising like the buzz of angry bees. "Mr. Carter, do you think AeroSky should lose its license to operate Jordan? Will you run for office after this?" He kept walking, jaw set, eyes forward. Every flashbulb reminded him of the night his father's funeral had been interrupted by police lights outside the church. The world watching, judging, never seeing the full story. That memory returned now, pressing against his chest as he entered the hearing room. Inside, rows of congressmen and congresswomen sat poised behind long desks, their nameplates gleaming under the lights. The chamber buzzed with anticipation. The gallery was packed with journalists, advocates, and citizens who had waited in line for hours. Among them were faces Jordan recognized from letters sent in recent weeks. A teacher who had been humiliated during boarding. A veteran forced to give up his seat despite medical needs. Their presence was a reminder that this was bigger than him. Committee Chairwoman Evelyn Thompson, a sharp-eyed legislator from Illinois, gavelled the room to order. Her voice carried authority without arrogance. "We are here today to address disturbing allegations of systemic discrimination within AeroSky Airlines. Mr. Jordan Carter, thank you for your presence. You may begin your testimony." Jordan adjusted the microphone, his hand steady though his pulse pounded in his ears. He glanced at Sophia and Dana seated just behind him, their supportive nods grounding him. Then he began, "Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I am not here today because of my position as CEO of Luminatech or because of the platform I hold. I am here because of what happened to me as a passenger. And because what happened to me happens to others every single day who do not have the same resources or visibility. He paused, letting the words sink in. The room was silent, every ear tuned. I boarded AeroSky Flight 392 with a valid boarding pass for Seat 2A. I was asked to give up that seat, not because of safety, not because of policy, but because another passenger preferred it. When I refused, I was threatened, humiliated, and removed. The actions were captured on video. But what matters is not the footage. What matters is the culture that made those actions possible. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jordan continued, "This is not about one flight attendant, one supervisor, or even one airline. This is about an industry where bias can dictate who is treated with dignity and who is treated with suspicion. The data we have collected at Lumina Tech shows a pattern. Passengers of color are disproportionately flagged for security concerns, disproportionately asked to show additional identification, disproportionately denied the benefits of the seats they paid for. This is not random, it is systemic." One congressman leaned forward, frowning. "Mr. Carter, are you suggesting that AeroSky Airlines has an official policy of discrimination?" Jordan met his gaze. "No. What I am suggesting is more insidious. The official policies may be neutral, but the lived reality is not. And when complaints are ignored, when whistleblowers are silenced, when passengers are told they were imagining bias, the system itself becomes complicit." The congressman leaned back, chastened. Chairwoman Thompson nodded. "Mr. Carter, what reforms would you recommend?" Jordan inhaled slowly, aware that every word would be scrutinized. "First, mandatory bias and ethics training for all staff, from ground crew to executives. Second, a transparent reporting system with real-time escalation to regulators. Third, passenger advocacy representatives at every major airport, empowered to intervene when disputes arise. And fourth, accountability that reaches the top. Not just punishing the lowest level employee, but holding leadership responsible for the culture they create." The room erupted in murmurs again. Some nodded in approval. Others whispered about feasibility, cost, union backlash. Jordan pressed on. "These are not radical ideas. They are the minimum steps required to ensure that every passenger, regardless of appearance, is treated with fairness. And I will add this as the largest shareholder of AeroSky. I intend to make these reforms conditions of my continued investment." The final line hung heavy in the air. Even members of Congress exchanged glances. This was not just testimony, it was a declaration of leverage. After his statement, questions came rapid fire. Some lawmakers praised him. Others tried to poke holes in his credibility. One asked whether he had exaggerated the incident for publicity. Jordan felt his jaw tighten, but kept his tone calm. "With respect, Congressman, I didn't need this for publicity. My company was already valued at billions. If anything, this has complicated my life. But some complications are worth facing when the alternative is silence." The gallery erupted in applause before the gavel restored order. When the session recessed for lunch, Jordan retreated to a small side room, alone for the first time that day. He slumped into a chair, rubbing his temples. His reflection in the polished tabletop looked older, wearier. For a moment he wondered if he was making a mistake, if pushing this hard would break him. Sophia entered quietly, setting a cup of coffee before him. "You did well," she said softly. He shook his head. "I don't know if it's enough. What if it all collapses? What if the reforms get watered down and nothing changes?" She sat across from him, her eyes steady. "Then you push again and again. until they can't ignore it. Jordan, you've carried this vow since you were 11 years old. You don't get to stop now. Her words steadied him, but the doubt lingered. He thought of his father's grave, of the promise whispered in the cold morning air. He thought of the boy in Riverton who coded games while the world outside whispered he would never matter. That boy deserved this fight. The world deserved this fight. By afternoon, the hearings resumed. This time, AeroSky executives were called to testify. Edward Hawkins, the CEO, sat at the witness table, sweat glistening at his temple. His voice trembled as he tried to explain away the incident. "We regret what happened to Mr. Carter. It does not reflect our values." Jordan watched from the gallery, noting how many times Hawkins avoided direct responsibility, how often he deferred to ongoing reviews. The contrast was clear. One man spoke from lived conviction, the other from corporate damage control. When the hearings adjourned at dusk, the headlines were immediate. Carter's testimony rocks Congress. AeroSky executives flounder under pressure. Social media lit up again. Clips of Jordan's testimony circulating with hashtags like "Indignity in the Skies" and "Carter Effect." Back in his hotel that night, Jordan stood at the window overlooking the Capitol dome. The city pulsed with lights, but he felt the weight of the darkness pressing in. His phone buzzed endlessly with calls and messages, but he ignored them all. For once, he let the silence wrap around him. In that silence, the doubts crept back. Would the hearings lead to real change, or just more speeches and headlines? Could one man, even with resources and determination, truly bend an industry? He closed his eyes, whispering into the quiet, "I can't do this alone." But when he opened them again, the reflection staring back at him carried something deeper than doubt. It carried resolve. The hearings had not ended the fight. They had only sharpened it. The hearings had shaken the foundations of AeroSky Airlines. But what came after would decide whether the turbulence would destroy the company or transform it. For Jordan Carter, the weeks following Washington were a blur of strategy meetings, media appearances, and late nights wrestling with the weight of expectation. On a brisk Friday morning in New York, Jordan stood at the glass wall of Lumina Tech's headquarters, gazing out at the skyline. The city looked alive, but he felt strangely detached, as though he were watching it through water. Behind him, Sofia Martinez entered with a folder thick with reports. "They agreed," she said, her voice carrying both relief and gravity. "The AeroSky board has voted to adopt every single reform you demanded. Full implementation, with independent oversight." Jordan turned slowly. "All of them." She nodded. Bias training across the workforce. The transparent reporting system with real-time escalation. Passenger advocates in every hub. Leadership accountability written into executive contracts. It's official. For a moment, Jordan felt the air leave his lungs. He had braced himself for half measures, watered-down compromises. But here it was. Full acknowledgement. Full compliance. The magnitude of it was staggering. Dana Whitmore entered, holding her tablet aloft, and the market responded. AeroSky's stock rebounded 6% this morning. Media outlets are calling it the most aggressive civil rights reform in aviation history. Jordan lowered himself into a chair, running a hand over his face. Relief mingled with exhaustion. Pride tangled with unease. Change had come, but at what cost? He thought of the employees fired, of Catherine Whitfield disgraced in the public eye, of the countless letters from passengers who saw in his story their own humiliation reflected back. Victory did not erase the pain. It simply redirected it towards something larger. Later that afternoon, he walked into AeroSky's headquarters for the first time since the incident. The building hummed with an odd mix of anxiety and anticipation. Employees lined the hallways, whispering as he passed. Some nodded respectfully. Others avoided his eyes. The weight of their stares pressed on him like invisible hands. In the main auditorium, hundreds of employees sat waiting. On stage, AeroSky CEO Edward Hawkins stood behind a podium. His usual polish had worn thin, his face pale under the lights. "Today marks a turning point for this company," Hawkins said, "and it is only right that you hear directly from the man whose courage forced us to face what we had long ignored. Mr. Jordan Carter." Applause rippled through the room as Jordan stepped forward. He set his notes aside, choosing instead to speak from the heart. "I did not ask for this fight," he began, his voice steady but weighted. "I boarded that plane simply as a passenger. But what happened revealed something bigger than one seat, one flight, one humiliation. It revealed how bias, when left unchecked, corrodes trust. And without trust, no airline can truly fly." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some looked hardened with skepticism, others softened with hope. "You may be wondering if I am here as your critic or as your partner. The truth is, I am both. I will hold this company accountable, but I will also walk beside you in building something better, because the world is watching, and because passengers deserve nothing less." Silence filled the room, followed by a swell of applause that grew into a standing ovation. Hawkins looked on, equal parts relieved and diminished, as Jordan took his seat again. The reforms rolled out with breathtaking speed. Training sessions transformed conference rooms into spaces of reckoning. Employees sat through simulations that forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. Some resisted, arms crossed, eyes rolling. Others wept openly as they recognized patterns in themselves they had never named. Passenger advocates were hired, stationed in every major airport. Their vests became a quiet symbol of reassurance, visible proof that someone was there to stand up for fairness. Complaints that once disappeared into bureaucratic voids now triggered immediate investigations. The culture began to shift. Gate agents reported feeling empowered to speak against unfair practices. Flight attendants who once whispered about favoritism found themselves supported when they refused inappropriate requests. For the first time in decades, surveys showed passengers of color reporting equal satisfaction as their white counterparts. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Meanwhile, Jordan found himself at the center of a storm that extended far beyond AeroSky. Universities invited him to speak. Advocacy groups sought his endorsement. Politicians floated his name as a future leader. He deflected most of it, focusing instead on the mission. And yet, late at night, the doubts lingered. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the change would endure once the headlines faded. Would AeroSky revert to old habits when the spotlight dimmed? Would the industry follow, or simply treat this as an isolated spectacle? One night, unable to sleep, he opened the box he kept in his closet. Inside was the cracked pair of glasses his father had worn the night he died, the night Jordan had made his vow. He held them gently in his hands, as if they were sacred. "I kept my word. Dad," he whispered, "but I don't know if it's enough." Tears blurred his vision, but he let them fall, because strength was not the absence of doubt. It was carrying the doubt and moving forward anyway. Months passed, and the impact became undeniable. Reports showed bias-related complaints down 70% across AeroSky flights. Employee satisfaction rose to record levels. Rival airlines, under pressure from both customers and regulators, began adopting similar reforms. What had started as one man's humiliation had grown into an industry-wide reckoning. On the 6-month anniversary of the incident, AeroSky held a public event at its largest hub. Passengers, employees, and community leaders gathered beneath banners that read "Dignity in the Skies." Jordan was invited to speak once more. Standing at the podium, he looked out at the crowd, at faces of every shade and background, families with children, veterans in uniform, students clutching backpacks, each one a reminder of why this mattered. "I was asked once," he began, "why I did not simply walk away. Why not take another flight, another airline, another path of less resistance? The answer is simple. Because walking away leaves the problem untouched for the next person, and the next, and the next. Sometimes we are called to stand, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary." The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, and for the first time in months, Jordan allowed himself to smile fully. Not a smile of victory, but of resolve. That night, as he returned home, he sat at his desk and opened his journal. On the first page, beneath his father's name, he wrote 3 words: "It was worth it." The fight was far from over, but it had begun. And for Jordan Carter, that was enough. And so, from one humiliating moment aboard AeroSky Flight 392 came a transformation no one saw coming. Jordan Carter's quiet strength forced an airline, an industry, and a society to confront the truth bias is not about policy. It's about people, about choices made in silence, or with courage. The staff who failed him lost their jobs. The passenger who thought privilege was power lost her reputation. But more importantly, thousands of employees, millions of passengers, and countless voices around the world gained something far greater, a reminder that justice, even delayed, is still possible. And yet, this story leaves us with a question. How many others, without cameras or influence, have faced the same humiliation but never found justice? How many stories remain untold? This is why we share these stories, not just to remember the pain, but to create change together. If Jordan's journey moved you, if it made you angry, hopeful, or reflective, let us know in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because together we will keep telling stories that defend dignity, expose injustice, and remind the world that every person deserves respect.